Welcome to today's video, which is to talk you through John Agard's Checking Out Me History. This is a great poem. It's been on the GCSE spec for a long time. It's really interesting to fit into ideas about power and conflict, though. But there are definite links we can make to some of the other poems. There are some great stuff online about this poem because, like I said, it's been on the GCSE for a while. Before I go through this, or before you watch this video going through the poem, make sure you watch the video on the BBC Learning Zone of John Agard talking through the poem himself and reading the poem, because it kind of has to be heard. It's definitely a poem that's made to be spoken and listened to, rather than dissected as we're going to do now in the video. So make sure you've done that first. What I'm going to do now is go through the poem using the highlighter codes that we use. So word analysis, device language analysis, structural analysis, and then ideas about power and conflict. There's lots of things. It's quite a long poem, this one, and there's lots of things to comment on, but it's kind of written with a lot of repetition in mind, and it follows like a pattern. So it kind of gets to a point where we'll be saying similar things. It's not a hard poem to understand. Now, if you've watched the video, what you'll know is that the poem is really about self-identity and cultural identity, and it's about education as well. So let's just make a couple of notes on here. So about cultural identity, in a sense it is autobiographical, as Agard talks about in the video. So cultural identity, what I'm going to put is questions Eurocentric education. So the poem is asking why somebody like John Agard throughout his education has only been taught certain things, and why history is taught in a very Eurocentric way, so it's all about Europe. Now, I've said this before in classrooms, and students have always said, that's because we live in Europe, that's because we're in England, and to an extent that is a valid point. But we also live in what is essentially a multicultural society, a society that is full of people from different backgrounds, different heritages, but also we should be learning really about the world. We should be learning about all of our history. And a lot of the people that are mentioned by Agard in this poem do have relevance to British history as well. He's not really exclusively talking about the history of other countries. It's also how Britain has affected other countries. So I agree with the message in this poem, and hopefully by the time we've got to analysing the end of the poem, you can see that he's making a very valid point. This is a great poem for writer's message, because the message is so clear. So let's get started. We're going to start with some structural comments, because as you listen to it, you would have noticed there's a lot of patterning and repetition. So what we've got is this repetition of dem tell me, and we've got it throughout the poem. Okay, every time that that the speaker mentions something that he is taught at school, or taught spoken, things like nursery rhymes, etc., all the way through. And then at the end, there's the whole repetition of what's mentioned at the start, but then there's kind of a shift there. Okay, so the repetition across the poem of this structurally emphasises the way that Agard is always returning or going back to the same voice or education. And when we go through these different kind of these different things he mentions that he's taught about, we'll talk about why he's probably mentioning them. Now, when he says them, meaning obviously the pronoun them, first of all, we'll just mention that the poem is written in the dialect of the speaker, so the way he speaks. Although that kind of varies between when he talks about it should just be dialect of the speaker. It kind of varies from when he talks about what he's been told, and then the language does shift slightly when he gives the Black history in the sections that are in italics. Also, dem is kind of quite an ambiguous pronoun. Ambiguous meaning vague. The them that he refers to, we don't really know what it is. It could be the government, because obviously the government set the curriculum. It could be, teachers and schools. Or it could be society in general. The people that control what we learn about. Okay, we'll move on to this next stanza. So he talks about how he feels that the bandage up my eye, or he's telling them they are bandaging up my eye with my own history and blinding me to my own identity. There's a really interesting metaphor here. So bandage and blind are imperative verbs. So he's almost commanding them, or he feels like other people are being commanded to blind him. This kind of metaphor of being blinded is really interesting. It's focused on an idea of restriction, and also being controlled. It links really nicely. I think this metaphor is a great one to compare with London, the Mind-Forged Manacles. The difference, of course, being that in London, people are forging them in their minds, whereas here he feels like someone else is bandaging him up and blinding him. But both of those metaphors are to do with being restricted by society, so they have a great comparison. Okay, so if we move on to some more, the kind of bulk of the poem, what we have throughout the poem is a clear juxtaposition between what he's been taught and what he hasn't been taught about. And the things that he has been taught are, some of the things I would argue are things that are taught quite low down in education, in school. Now, 1066, as you may or may not know, is the Battle of Hastings. I was taught that, I think, in year 7. But Dick Whittington and the Cat is interesting because Dick Whittington and the Cat is kind of a folk tale. A story that was told traditionally verbally, and it is now most commonly known and used in a pantomime. So something that is kind of laughed at and a little bit silly. And what Agard does is he then juxtaposes or uses juxtaposition between the kind of ridiculous things that we're taught and we're made to remember, and then these things that are never mentioned, these historical figures in Black history that are extremely significant. So, Toussaint L'ouverture, I'm not very good with French accent, but it's a French name, is a leader, and he was the leader of the Haitian, spelled that wrong, there's 2 I's, Haitian Revolution, who essentially fought Napoleon, who's obviously known as a significant military leader, and actually defeated Napoleon. And what they did is they created the first Black Republic. So the reason I haven't started... Oh, God, I don't know why I did that in capitals. The reason... probably gets it in capitals here. The reason I haven't started with context with this one is because the context kind of is embedded throughout the poem. It's got to talk about the different historical figures. What Toussaint L'ouverture did is he fought against racial oppression. And won. So a significant figure in terms of Black history. As it says, a slave with a vision. So a slave indicating that this was somebody who was oppressed and then fought back and took control, created the first Black Republic. The interesting, I think, metaphor within this is the reference to him as a beacon. So this metaphor is interesting because it links to ideas to do with light, brightness, which, as we've mentioned before with Macbeth and other poems, that's synonymous with, we associate that as a positive image. But also a beacon often leads people. So Agard saying that Toussaint L'ouverture was a significant leader within this, using this metaphor. And also a beacon often is a fire, so it's burning. So yeah, interesting things there. What then happens is we flip back to the juxtaposition of the things that we're traditionally taught in education, but they're quite interesting ones. Obviously, what Agard is doing is he's downplaying the stuff that people are taught, and then giving significant historical figures of Black history who aren't taught. It's kind of like a hyperbolized version of juxtaposition, the way he focuses on these different things. He talks about the man who discovers the balloon, and what I really like about this kind of ambiguous noun of man is kind of ironic, because what it's saying is that he doesn't know the name. So you've gone from the repetition of Toussaint 4 times to this man who discovered the balloon. So can't be that important. I don't know the name either. And then you go from the cow who jumped over the moon, which is obviously a nursery rhyme, as well as the dish ran away with the spoon. Now, what we'll do here is just highlight in orange. We've gone from the man who discovered the balloon, jumped over the moon, ran away with the spoon, to Nanny Demon. And what kind of is going on here, if we talk about power and conflict, there's 2 things. Okay, we've got the conflict between the ridiculous things that are taught versus the important figures of Black history. So that's kind of how the poem is kind of related to ideas about conflicts, and also a lot of the figures are leaders of conflict, various conflicts. And then what you've got in terms of power, Agard is perhaps commenting on a lack of power over your own education. Which is an interesting comment to make, that education probably doesn't allow people to choose what they study, and that probably is the case. Okay, we'll go on to this bit here now. We now move on to Nanny Demon, who is, I think, the only female, but definitely considered a national hero of Jamaica. Now, what Nanny Demon was the leader of the Maroons, who escaped slavery in Jamaica and defended the place they lived against attacks, so that they were free slaves. And what we've got here is some really interesting natural imagery. We'll do this in yellow for semantic fields. We've got Seafire Woman, Mountain Dream, Fire Woman, Struggle, Hopeful Stream, Freedom River. It's just some interesting imagery here. So semantic field. Of natural imagery, which I think is just highlighting the kind of strength and power of this woman. That kind of fought racial oppression, and was able to defend their own freedom, their own liberty. Not just her, but all of the Maroons. We now move on to mentions of military leaders. So he knows about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but he never learnt about Shaka the Great Zulu. So these are all, this is where I guess becomes a bit more about conflict. So these are all significant leaders. So, and battles. Shaka the Great Zulu was the leader of the Zulu Empire in southern Africa, and was a significant figure in Black history in terms of his leadership and his military style. So he's saying, well, yeah, I learnt about Lord Nelson and what happened at Waterloo, but I never learnt about Shaka the Great Zulu. So why do I learn about this person and not learning about this one? Then he moves on to explorers. So Columbus, famous explorer, in 1492, explored the world. Now, what happened was I was going to say invaded then, but in theory they say discovered, but the word probably is invaded. So Trinidad was invaded by Columbus, and the Caribs and the Arawaks were tribes that were essentially killed off by Columbus's arrival. Not only just by violence, but also by diseases. So if you know anything about when people explored the world and they found native people in the various places they went, and but what they also brought was diseases that the people who they invaded weren't immune to. So whether they killed them to take the land, or whether they spread disease and infections, either way, often what happened when Britain mainly colonised the rest of the world is they killed a lot of people off, which is horrendous, obviously, and if they didn't kill them off, they often enslaved them. So yeah, sorry, the video cut off. So yeah, we learn a lot about Columbus, for example, but not so much about the people that he ended up taking the land from and often killing off. Okay, so that's that stanza there. We move on to talk about essentially nurses now. So it mentions Florence Nightingale, who you probably know of. Florence Nightingale became infamous, really, because of her she started a hygiene system. She essentially introduced medicine to the world of hygiene. She did this during the Crimean War, but she did it not necessarily on the front line. So when it then mentions Mary C. Cole, it's juxtaposing Florence Nightingale and Mary C. Cole. We'll just mention Robin Hood first. He's saying that he was taught about Robin Hood. Now, Robin Hood is somebody that is often taught about in like primary school curriculums, but he's not necessarily a real person. It's more like a legendary character, a legend, a myth, probably loosely based on someone from a long time ago, but not necessarily real. And then you've got Old King Cole was a merry old soul, another nursery rhyme. And then what you have is Florence Nightingale juxtaposed with Mary C. Cole. Now, Mary C. Cole, the story of Mary C. Cole is extremely interesting. So she was a nurse like Nightingale. We'll put juxtaposes. Nightingale. She was a black nurse. So she came from Jamaica. She basically went to the Crimean War. She volunteered, she offered to go as a nurse, and the British government basically didn't want her there. Possibly that was racially motivated. What she ended up doing was making her own money and funding herself to go. So she braved the Russian snow in the Crimean War, and she became a nurse actually on the front line. She saved a lot of men with much more hands-on nursing than Florence Nightingale. And the point that Agard's making here is that Nightingale is the one we know. We've never heard of Mary C. Cole, and is that because she was Jamaican and she was black? But the interesting thing, of course, is that she went and helped the British during the Crimean War. So why isn't she taught? Why don't we learn about her? Now, excuse me, much like the other, what we'll do here is we'll just highlight this. Pinks, we've got Mary C. Cole and Florence Nightingale juxtaposed there. And then what we also have is a couple of, similar to the other ones, we've got Healing Star and Yellow Sunrise. So we've got, again, these metaphors, which are also natural images. And images of light. Again, to show the strength and power of her in particular, of Mary C. Cole in particular. So this is, I always find this one quite an interesting one, because the issue here, of course, is that we learn about someone who maybe didn't have as much as a practical approach to nursing, but we learn about them, and is that because that person's white? And that's the question that Agard's asking us. Now, we go back to this phrasing from the opening stanza, but there's a clear structural shift here. Because what he does is he repeats, them tell me. What it becomes now is, but now. So, yeah, they're telling me these things, but there's a sense of him having, the speaker having moved on. And he's not necessarily entirely angry. There's a sense of frustration in the poem. But now what's kind of happened is he's accepting the kind of the challenge, I guess, or accepting that he has to fix this, and that he's going to research and find out about his own cultural identity, his heritage, and educate himself. And that's what's a really interesting kind of uplifting end to the poem. Now, what we also have here, and like I've said this before, like opening and closing lines of poems are always quite important. This is a great way to sum up kind of the place that Agard gets to by the end of the poem. He says, I carving out me identity. Okay, so he's gone from being perhaps angry at the start and feeling bandaged and blinded up here to being ready to take it on himself. There's a lot of dem, but the final lines go to I. So we've got this shift in personal pronouns. So it's more about his actions and how he's gonna kind of combat this feeling of educational oppression, I guess. What's also great about this line is the verb carving. It's kind of a metaphor. The really interesting thing about when you carve something is that it's a slow process. It takes time. It's a craft and something you have to be careful with. And so we really get the sense that Agard is ready to kind of create his own identity, but he knows it might take time and it might kind of be something that he has to work at. But he's ready to accept that kind of challenge and make sure he's educated on all these people that he feels like he's been restricted from knowing, hence why he's checking out his own history, he's doing it himself. So the poem kind of, in a sense, becomes about like a kind of awakening in his own heritage and his own culture, because he's frustrated that these aren't the things that he's learned, yes, but actually he's going to use this opportunity to find out about it himself. So we're going to just put some links in here. We'll start with the emigre. Because they're both about your identity associated with a place. Now another one which we haven't done yet, but it links really well. Kamikaze, which is to do with national identity. This is also a poem about kind of taking back control, taking back power, seeking like a sense of liberation or freedom from feeling like people are oppressing you. So in that way you can make links to London. So I mentioned the mind-forged manacles being quite like the bandage up my eye blind me, and there's other links you can make to London with this poem, the sense that like society or someone in the establishment, so in this case it's education, it's the government, in London it's the religion, it's the monarchy, it's all those things, trying to oppress society or inhabitants or people, or in this case the speaker himself. Hopefully that was useful. That's kind of checking out my history in a nutshell. There's some really, as I've said at the start, there's some really good videos. There's some really good links online that go through this poem quite successfully. So check some of those out and see you soon.